Guy on Indy presents the podcast. Today's topic, Malcolm X. Today's special guest, Dr. David Polizzi. Today's podcast is sponsored by Indy Filmmakers Forum at yahoo.com. Are you interested in professional production and live in the Midwest? Then contact Indy Filmmakers Forum at yahoo.com, the premier film networking group in the Midwest. Welcome back. We are with Dr. David Polizzi discussing Malcolm X and his book, A Phenomenological Hermeneutic of Anti-Black Racism in the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Okay, David, welcome back. We're going to start with Chapter 1, Setting the Stage and the Black Autobiography. You quote in your book, African American Biography has been a powerful means in addressing and altering socio-political as well as cultural realities in the United States. What features of the African American autobiography could you cite a few examples?
Yeah, Guy, nice to be back again. The Black Autobiography really has two specific kind of manifestations and projects. The initial idea of Black autobiography is really given birth in what are called the slave narratives. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and others. The project of those narratives were to dispel this idea that somehow blackness was not human or somehow inferior, or somehow less than white experience. It was to address some of the fundamental beliefs that allowed slavery to take place in this attempt to sort of deconstruct them and to provide a voice and a sense of resistance to that. The second part of Black autobiography doesn't get significant changes until about the late 1940s into the 50s with Emilio Baraka and his kind of transformational autobiography, along with, of course, Malcolm X, that comes about 10 years later, where it's dealing now not with any attempt to argue the humanity of black existence. It's more to confront the oppression of anti-black societies, in this case, American racism, American anti-black racism. So it's more focused on addressing the conditions that are often used to perpetuate racism.
Okay. You mentioned, please discuss psychology's bias towards absolute agency of the self and how this applies to our discussion.
Yeah, particularly in this kind of conversation, the absolute agency of the self would somehow feel or somehow opine that agency is omnipotent and therefore, given that fact, could construct an existence that were better than what is currently experienced if it desired. So it's almost becomes it's failure due to lack of will, a failure due to lack of intelligence, a failure due to the lack of creativity, however you would like to look at it. Mm-hmm. Because if agency is absolute, then agency therefore should have the power to somehow find a way out of the conditions that it has to confront.
Okay.
Phenomenology, for example, would certainly focus on human agency, but it would reject pretty much out of hand the idea that human agency is somehow omnipotent.
Okay.
We always have agency. We always have an ability to choose. But choice is always in a context.
Mm-hmm.
You can't choose to eat steak if steak isn't a viable possibility.
Gotcha.
You can't suddenly materialize it.
Gotcha. So your agency is limited to the scope that the culture or the society allows you to have it. Is that what you're saying?
In a way, I wouldn't want to put it in such absolute causal terms like that. But generally, the more fluid a context is relative to the possibilities that it doesn't attempt to hold back, then the more likely that human agency will be able to shine. However, from a phenomenological point, and Heidegger is certainly focused on this, is that human existence, human being is fundamentally predicated by limitations. The biggest one obviously being the limitation of death. And so the issue becomes, how does one transcend that existential fact? Why live if I'm going to die, right, is the existential claim.
Yeah.
And so one has to find a way to be, but to find a way to be that in the end will not be able to prevent the final end.
Gotcha.
And so there's agency, there's choice, but humans are not gods.
Okay. Please discuss Heidegger's definition of the they self and how that applies to our discussion in your work.
Sure. Heidegger's notion of the they selves comes from a larger concept called the care structure. And so there's thrownness, there's facticity, and there's falling prey. And falling prey sort of falls into the context of the they. But the they also plays a role in the sense that the they is what, in using Heidegger's term, the they is that which legitimizes, the they is that which recognizes success and denies others. So it's this idea that if you were in a group, there'll be a set of rules. Now, they could be very broad and almost not very rule-like, or they can be very specific. And if you were to break those rules, you're now ostracized. You're now seen as deviant in some way because you violated some norm. We all have that. I mean, whether it's families, whether it's larger friend groups, whether it's society, even whether it's kind of issues with nations. So the they, within Heidegger's sense, is this structure, though it's not really an object, it's this kind of structure that provides meaning to identity, gives being in a world a sort of a foundational self of what it is, or sense of what it is, and then, per what we've been talking about, then allows for an agency to pursue one's projects. But it also means that as you're pursuing a project, you're also covering perhaps other possibilities. That to be in the world in relation to this they could be very restrictive, where if you were a man, you have to be this. If you're a woman, you have to be that. Within the context of racism, that if you're black, you are constructed as negative or inferior or threatening or violent, etc. And it's not allowing the same possibilities as others are allowed to be. And so agency is always in relation to this they for Heidegger, though he probably wouldn't be talking about agency or even consciousness. For him, he's talking about being. He's talking about what is human being. He talks about what are the basic characteristics of being human, and then how do those definitions allow for being in the world to take on its projects? But if you're being in the world as a woman, for example, or being in the world as a African American, or being in the world as a Muslim or a homosexual or lesbian, however we want to construct that. If there are social prohibitions against those identities, those individuals are going to have a more difficult time. It doesn't mean that resistance is impossible, and it doesn't even mean that success of one's agency isn't possible. But it means that there will be a struggle, because there are these walls of meaning that tend to isolate, confine, and construct separations that aren't real.
They're constraints that others don't have.
Correct. Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, page 24, you say autobiography allows the narrator to reclaim his or her humanity, which the system of slavery has stolen. How is this in Malcolm X's book? How has he reclaimed his?
Well, Malcolm reclaims his experience, I would say, through his ability to situate his experience relative to his various confrontations with anti-black racism.
Okay.
And that's different, and I think the idea of the names, which is so fundamental in the autobiography, the names kind of set, and I make the argument that we're not talking about identity necessarily. though you could probably make that argument that he was. But I'm taking it more of the point that the name represents a phenomenological point of entry into a world.
Mm-hmm.
So when he's Malcolm Little, when he's a kid, his point of entry is really more the context created by his Garveyite parents that is fundamentally diametrically opposed to the idea of anti-black racism.
Yeah.
But then he has to go out, and now he's in a world where those same things, where blackness doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
And so you have these alternative theys. And again, the they structures meaning for being in the world. So we could say that, being in the world as African American in the 1930s or 2024 has certain restraints, but it may also mean that as a result of that, a way of being in the world gets created that seeks to resist, in Malcolm's case, vigorously and quite effectively resist racism, but it doesn't do away with it.
Gotcha.
So Malcolm's transformations never end racism, but it certainly to some degree ends the way in which the toxic effects of racism influence him, and I think by his preaching and his writing also helps others as well.
Okay, thank you for listening. As always on Guy and Indy, you are invited to listen in. Next up, Chapter 3. In the beginning, there was Malcolm Little. Hi, it's Guy and Indy. I'm here to sing Strangers by the Kinks. Where you going to? I don't mind. Killed my world and I killed my time. Where am I going to? What will I see? See many people coming after me. Where am I going to? I don't mind. Live too long, I'm afraid I'll die. I will follow you wherever you go. If your open hand is offered to me, strangers on this road we are on. We are not two, we are one. Strangers on this road we are on. We are not two, we are one.